From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Today, the United States is continuing to build its maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. I am announcing our intent to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including its Quds Force, as a foreign terrorist organization in accordance with Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act.
In an unprecedented move, the Trump administration's formally labeled an arm of another country's military a terrorist group. Despite concerns from the Pentagon and CIA, the move could put U.S. troops at risk. We'll look at what this means for U.S.-Iranian relations. Then President Trump pushes for more separation of families as he intensifies his crackdown on immigration and purges the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and the director of the Secret Service have already been removed as Trump puts hardline advisor Stephen Miller in charge of the nation's immigration policy.
Congress must end catch and release so that illegal border crossers can be quickly and safely returned to their home. Get out. Sorry, get out. Sorry, I can't handle it. And I told my people yesterday, our country's full. We're full. Our system's full. Our country's full. Can't come in.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House announced Monday the director of the Secret Service, Randolph Texalis, has been removed from his position one day after Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen's announced departure. As head of the Secret Service, he reported directly to Nielsen. Trump reportedly ordered his firing as part of a purge of top officials overseeing immigration policy and spearheaded by White House senior advisor Stephen Miller. CNN's reporting Francis Cisna, head of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and John Mitnick, general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security, could be next to leave the administration. In related news, NBC News reports Monday Trump has been pushing to revive his family separation policy at the southern U.S. border for months, and that Nielsen's resistance to the move further drove a wedge between the two. Unnamed officials who spoke to NBC said Nielsen told Trump the Department of Homeland Security could not act against federal court orders barring the policy, and that Trump would be defying his own executive order last year that put an end to it. Kevin McAleenan, head of Customs and Border Patrol and incoming acting DHS secretary, reportedly was open to reinstating a form of family separation in which families would have to choose between being separated or being taken into long-term detention with their children. Meanwhile, CNN's reporting Trump told border agents not to let migrants in and to tell judges we don't have room. On Friday, Trump repeated his call to get rid of immigration judges while speaking to reporters after making the comment earlier in the week while at a meeting with the Secretary General of NATO. In more immigration news, a federal judge in San Francisco has blocked President Trump's so-called Remain in Mexico policy, which forces asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases make their way through U.S. courts. Judge Richard Seaborg ruled the practice, which went into effect in January, violates existing immigration laws and does not comply with U.S. policy against returning migrants to countries where their, quote, life or freedom would be threatened. In a statement, Human Rights First, which represents clients affected by Trump's policy, said as President Trump rids the Department of Homeland Security of top officials in search of even more extreme immigration hardliners, today's ruling is a reminder that the policies already put in place to dismantle the asylum system are in many cases illegal and will not hold up in court, they wrote. Judge Seaborg's injunction is set to go into effect Friday. As the news broke Monday, reports emerged that Customs and Border Patrol were sending back multiple immigrant families to Mexico after they appeared in U.S. courts for their hearings. The Trump administration designated Iran's elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization Monday, the first time the U.S. has formally labeled an arm of another country's military a terrorist group. The Pentagon and CIA opposed the decision, warning it could put U.S. troops at risk, but National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo pushed for the move as the U.S. continues its, quote, maximum pressure campaign against Iran. This is Secretary Pompeo announcing the decision.
The first time that the United States has designated a part of another government as an FTO. We're doing it because the Iranian regime's use of terrorism as a tool of statecraft makes it fundamentally different from any other government. Businesses and banks around the world now have a clearer duty to ensure that companies with which they conduct financial transactions are not connected to the IRGC in any material way.
On Monday, Iran's Supreme National Security Council in return designated the United States Central Command, known as CENTCOM, and all its forces as terrorists. The council also labeled the U.S. a, quote, supporter of terrorism. We'll have more on the story after headlines with author and founder of the National Iranian American Council, Trita Parsi. In Israel, voters are heading to the polls today in a hotly contested parliamentary election that many say is a referendum on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 10-year rule. Netanyahu has been embroiled in multiple corruption scandals. His hardline nationalist rhetoric and policies have raised concern among centrist Israelis. Meanwhile, unwavering support from the Trump administration, including recent moves to recognize the Golan Heights as sovereign Israeli territory and to designate Iran's Revolutionary Guard as a terror group, has bolstered Netanyahu's popularity among conservative Israelis. Netanyahu's main opponent, former Army Chief Benny Gantz, who heads the Blue and White Party, has also relied on pro-security and military rhetoric, but claims he will be able to unite Israelis. As voting got underway around the country, a judge filed a complaint after Netanyahu's Likud party provided election observers at polling stations in Arab neighborhoods with 1,200 body cameras. In Libya, authorities shut down Tripoli's only operational airport Monday after forces from the eastern Libyan National Army launched an airstrike as they continue their offensive led by renegade General Khalifa Haftar. Haftar, a dual U.S.-Libyan citizen, started to lead his forces towards Tripoli last week in an attempt to seize the capital from the UN-backed Government of National Accord. The United Nations has called for an immediate truce and the evacuation of civilians caught in the crossfire. In Afghanistan, 3 U.S. military members and 1 U.S. contractor died Monday after a roadside bomb went off near Bagram Air Base outside the capital, Kabul. The Taliban have claimed responsibility for the attack. The deaths came amidst ongoing peace talks between the U.S. and Taliban officials and after a rash of attacks around Afghanistan in recent days killed dozens of Afghan security forces and military members. At least 32 military personnel were killed after Taliban fighters attacked an army base in western Baghdad province last week, according to Afghan officials. U.S. authorities have revoked the visa of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda, weeks after the Trump administration announced it was barring entry into the U.S. to ICC investigators who may be investigating alleged war crimes by the U.S. military in Afghanistan. Bensouda asked ICC judges to authorize an investigation into possible U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan in 2017. A 2016 ICC report accused the U.S. military of torturing at least 61 prisoners in Afghanistan and accused the CIA of subjecting at least 27 prisoners to torture, including rape, at a number of CIA prison sites. 3 former New York City firefighters involved in the 9/11 rescue effort died last week. They all suffered from illnesses related to their exposure to lethal toxins at the wreckage site of the Twin Towers. 2 of the men died of cancer. Funeral services for Timothy O'Neill, Kevin Lennon, and Michael Andriachi will be held this week. A fund set up to cover health care costs for 9/11 first responders and survivors is set to expire in 2020. Earlier this year, lawmakers, including New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, announced a bill to permanently fund the federal program. In Boston, 13 parents, including Hollywood actress Felicity Huffman and one coach, pleaded guilty to fraud as part of the elite college admissions scandal known as Operation Varsity Blues. Huffman admitted to paying $15,000 to have someone cheat on the SATs for her daughter. The money was funneled through a charity set up by the scheme's mastermind, Rick Singer. Stanford University announced this week they expelled a student who they say was connected to a $500,000 donation, quote, to Singer's charity, and who provided false information in their college application. Meanwhile, the Boston Globe reported last week that Harvard University is investigating the sale of a home belonging to the school's fencing coach to the father of a student who was soon after admitted to Harvard and onto the fencing team. The case is not believed to be related to Operation Varsity Blues. 2 Congress members have joined the crowded Democratic field for the 2020 presidential nomination. Tim Ryan of Ohio kicked off his campaign Saturday at a rally in Youngstown, where he touted his appeal to working-class voters from purple states.
Flyover states are my states. The flyover states are your states, and the flyover states are going to start governing in the United States of America again.
Ryan has backed key progressive issues, including Medicare for All and renewable energy initiatives. He previously worked against reproductive rights, but in 2015 reversed his position on abortion, saying the choice should be up to the women, not politicians. He also disavowed his prior relationship with the NRA, who for years gave him A ratings. After the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas, he pledged to donate contributions from the group to gun control efforts. On Monday, Eric Swalwell of California announced his candidacy on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert.
I talk to teachers and truckers and, nurses, and they feel like they're just running in place, and it's not adding up to anything. I talk to people who are just like me, who are the first in their family to go to college. They've got a lot of student debt, can't buy a home, can't start a business. I talk to kids who sit in their classroom afraid that they'll be the next victim of gun violence.
Congressman Swalwell sits on the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees, has been vocal on gun control, supports Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. His messaging has focused on issues affecting young people, such as student debt. The 2 new entries into the Democratic race bring the number to about 18 presidential candidates on the Democratic side. In Louisiana, authorities are investigating fires at 3 black churches over a period of 10 days, which they say are likely related, though no motive or suspect has been found thus far. No deaths or injuries were reported in the blazes. The first fire occurred at the end of last month and the 2 others last week, all in the same community about 30 minutes north of Lafayette. A 4th fire that occurred last Sunday at a predominantly white church in another part of Louisiana is also being investigated, but is not believed to be connected. In his latest attack on the environment, President Trump has reportedly slashed funding for the Obama-era conservation program that tackles issues such as climate change, flooding, and species extinction. Scientists who work for the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, or LCCs, told The Guardian over half the 22 groups that form the Conservation Collective have been dissolved or put on indefinite hiatus. This despite Congress approving renewed funding for landscape conservation cooperatives. One source told The Guardian, "I'd say there could be 5 to 6 years of work down the drain." Another lawsuit against Boeing has been filed in the U.S. over last month's fatal Ethiopian Airlines crash, which killed all 157 people on board. The family of 29-year-old Mukat Hussein Abdullah from Minnesota says Boeing neglected known safety issues in the design of its flight control system on the 737 MAX 8 aircraft and that it did not properly train pilots on the software. Last week, the family of 24-year-old Samia Stumo sued Boeing and filed a claim against the Federal Aviation Administration. Boeing's CEO admitted wrongdoing and apologized for the crash for the first time last week. And human rights activist Blaise Bonpane has died. For more than half a century, the former Maryknoll priest and longtime director of the Office of the Americas in Los Angeles worked to promote human rights in Latin America. He was a Catholic priest in Guatemala during the 1960s, where he was expelled for his efforts on behalf of the poor and the disenfranchised. For 50 years, Blaise Bonpane hosted the show World Focus on Pacifica Radio's KPFK in Los Angeles. He also authored many books, including Civilization is Possible, and his autobiography, Imagine No Religion. Noam Chomsky wrote of the book, quote, "I am often asked by young people, deeply disturbed by the state of the world, what can I do to make this sad world a better place? An eloquent answer now is, read Blaise Bonpein's autobiography. If you can aspire to a fraction of what he has achieved, you will look back on a life well lived," Chomsky said. This is Blaise Bonpein speaking in 1991 about U.S. militarism.
I think we have to deal with the ideology of militarism, because the militarism has become the very fabric of our culture. Militarism has no relationship to democracy. If it's militarist, it is anti-democratic. And if we base our thinking on might makes right, we really don't care about who has a claim to anything. We don't care about law. We become lawless. Our policy has been lawless in Central America, in South America, in Africa, in the Middle East. It has been lawless. It has been an argument and a policy of power and militarism.
To see our interviews with Blaise Bonpein, go to democracynow.org, including our trip with Blaise to Peru to visit Laurie Berenson in prison. Blaise Bonpein has died at the age of 89 years old. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners across the country and around the world. In an unprecedented move, the Trump administration has designated Iran's elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, resulting in sweeping economic and travel restrictions on its members. This marks the first time the United States has formally labeled an arm of another country's military a terrorist group. The Pentagon and CIA opposed the decision, warning it could put U.S. troops at risk. Key backers of the move included National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who formally announced the new policy on Monday.
Today, the United States is continuing to build its maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. I am announcing our intent to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including its Quds Force, as a foreign terrorist organization in accordance with Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. This designation will take effect 1 week from today. This is the first time that the United States has designated a part of another government as an FTO. We're doing it because the Iranian regime's use of terrorism as a tool of statecraft makes it fundamentally different from any other government. This historic step will deprive the world's leading state sponsor of terror the financial means to spread misery and death around the world.
The step is the latest in the White House's efforts to isolate Iran after the U.S. withdrew from the landmark Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on the country last year, despite widespread international condemnation. The New York Times reports the Trump administration timed the announcement in an attempt to give a last-minute boost to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ahead of today's elections in Israel. Netanyahu thanked Trump on Twitter for taking the action against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iranian officials swiftly condemned the new policy and warned the designation will destabilize the region. On Monday, Iran's Supreme National Security Council retaliated by designating the United States Central Command, known as CENTCOM, and all its forces as terrorist. The council also labeled U.S. as a supporter of terrorism. Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Trita Parsi, the founder of the National Iranian American Council. His most recent book is titled Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. He's also the author of A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. Trita Parsi is an adjunct associate professor in the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. Trita, welcome back to Democracy Now! The significance of this U.S. designation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as terrorist, and then Iran reciprocates by doing the same with Central Command.
So there's both short-term and long-term consequences of this. In the short term, of course, as the CIA and the Pentagon themselves have warned, is that this actually does increase the risk of confrontation in the region. And in that sense, it actually makes the United States less safe by increasing the likelihood of war. The long-term effects, however, I think are even more problematic because they're more likely. And that is that this move seems to be designed to entrap the United States in a permanent state of enmity with Iran. See, if a future administration, let's say in 2020 or 2024, decides that he actually wants to reverse some of the measures of the Trump administration, he wants to re-enter the JCPOA, or he just wants to pursue some form of normal diplomacy with Iran in order to reduce tensions with that country, it will find its political maneuverability significantly inhibited by this decision. For instance, being able to go back into the JCPOA requires the United States to lift the sanctions that it has been reimposing under the Trump administration. But that will be much, much more difficult now because those sanctions have been reimposed under the terrorism clause, and now the IRGC is on the terrorist list. So the political capital for the next administration to do something constructive and actually create some sort of a diplomatic momentum with Iran will necessitate reversing this decision on the IRGC. And that's an extremely heavy lift. And as a result, the future opportunities for diplomacy are going to be significantly hampered by this, which then traps the United States in this prolonged, almost permanent state of enmity with Iran, which I think is precisely what someone like Netanyahu and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia actually are looking for.
And Trita, what about the impact on neighboring countries, especially Iraq and Syria, where effectively the Revolutionary Guard functioned, were in effect working together with the United States against ISIS?
Yes, so in Iraq, for instance, the IRGC and the Iranians were, according to the Iraqis, the first ones to arrive, the first ones to send in ammunition and help in order to defeat ISIS. And according to the Iraqi defense minister, had it not been for Iran, Baghdad likely would have fallen to ISIS. And then, because this was during the Obama administration, the Iranians and the Americans coordinated through the Iraqis how they were jointly defeating and fighting back against ISIS. That type of an opportunity for collaboration obviously now is closed off as a result of this designation. Moreover, this is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on Iraq. Iraq is already in a very delicate situation. The country has been severely destabilized as a result of the invasion, and they are stuck between the United States and Iran. They need the Iranians for a whole set of different things, and most importantly, they want to avoid becoming an arena in which the United States and Iran fight each other on Iraqi soil. So they're really a drive-by shooting victim in all of this. And this designation makes it even more difficult for them because many of the companies and many of the entities that they're working with in Iran are one way or another connected to the IRGC. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. According to the U.S. government itself, this designation may include up to as many as 11 million people, almost 1/8 of Iran's population. So this is not designating a small entity that is actually manageable. This is talking about 11 million people. And you can then imagine how problematic that will be for neighboring countries who, for their own interests, obviously want to have some sort of a peaceful relationship with Iran.
All of this is coming as Iran is struggling under heavy flooding. The New York Times reports that Iran's foreign ministry accused the Trump administration of blocking efforts to aid Iranian victims of calamitous floods through inhumane and cruel restrictions imposed by renewed American banking sanctions on the country. Can you explain what's happening here?
The Trump administration, and as Secretary Pompeo said, has gone for what they call the maximum pressure campaign. They have reimposed sanctions. They have threatened banks with astronomical fines. They have imposed astronomical fines for anyone who has been even just in the gray zone of violating those sanctions. And as a result, they have created a situation in which no banks are willing to deal with Iranian banking system. And incidentally, I think it's also important to note much of this existed during the Obama administration as well, because that's when this maximum strategy actually originated from. But then once the nuclear deal was struck, the U.S. government at that time went on a tour and were essentially doing everything they could to get banks to start connecting with Iranian banks again. The Trump administration has reversed that. They have scared away all of the banks. And as a result, even though these transactions are not sanctioned by the United States, they are not prohibited by the United States, the pressure on the banks has led to a scenario in which no one is willing to handle the transactions, which has left the Iranians in a very precarious situation because it's very difficult for them to now get aid from the outside because no one is willing to handle those financial transactions.
And what about the impact internally on Iran of this latest move, the Trump administration, given the fact that the Rouhani administration, a more moderate administration, clearly was seeking to, in one way or another, rein in the Revolutionary Guard?
Yeah, this is quite a bit of an irony of all of this. The Rouhani government has been at loggerheads with the IRGC for quite some time. And has tried to really reduce the IRGC's influence on Iran society, which is very extensive. And it should be noted that the IRGC itself has played a very negative role in clampdowns, in repression, etc., inside the country. But now, as a result of this decision, you can clearly see a rallying around the flag situation in Iran, in which a lot of the folks that are very critical of the IRGC, view them as their political opponents, have now felt forced to come out and defend the IRGC because now they're all essentially sensing that they're in the same boat. And this is one part of the very counterproductive notion of this decision. Instead of actually creating more space for those in Iran who want to see a more open society, who want to move Iran closer to the West, offer the population far greater freedoms, etc. Those forces right now are on the defensive because of the aggression by the Trump administration, and they're even feeling forced to come out and defend the IRGC, even though under normal circumstances they would be viewing the IRGC as their main opponents for the purpose of bringing greater democracy to Iran.
In 2017, Adam Davidson of The New Yorker wrote a piece headlined, "Donald Trump's Worst Deal." According to the article, Trump helped build a hotel in Azerbaijan that appears to be a corrupt operation engineered by oligarchs tied to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Davidson reports the Trump Organization's chief legal officer, Alan Garten, acknowledged that Trump and his daughter Ivanka knew their Baku, Azerbaijan partners were likely laundering money for the Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Davidson tweeted Monday asking reporters to include these details in their reporting on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard terrorist designation. Can you explain this, Trita?
Well, should we really be surprised by now, mindful of everything else that we know about how the Trump organization has been operating? I don't see why we would think at all that the Trump organization would have any qualms about dealing with a company in Azerbaijan that likely was laundering money for the IRGC. And what this really shows, that what this comes down to, is not because there was a great sense that this actually would advance America's national interests or that this truly would put more pressure on Iran economically. In fact, the IRGC is already tremendously sanctioned. This designation does not add any significant or meaningful additional economic pressure on the IRGC. All it does is that it creates political obstacles for future administrations to be able to actually resolve tensions with Iran. And I think that is very much the intent of someone like John Bolton. It's very much the intent of Bibi Netanyahu and MBS, and the Israelis have been pushing for this for a very, very long time. And the Trump administration has essentially auctioned out its foreign policy in the Middle East to the highest bidder and is doing a tremendous amount of favors to its allies there, completely disregarding what this will have, the impact that this will have on the U.S.'s own national interests. It is noteworthy that both the Pentagon and the CIA oppose this. They have opposed this for quite some time when these proposals were first brought up more than 10 years ago, precisely because of the fact that it actually makes America less safe. That does not seem to be much of a concern for Donald Trump, however.
And Trita, would you comment on the potential impact of the Iranian government declaring the United States Central Command as a terrorist organization? Now, what potentially that could lead to in the Middle East?
I don't think that response by the Iranians will lead to them actually targeting U.S. troops or anything of that measure. But what it does show is that pressure gets counter-pressure. Instead of thinking that this maximum pressure campaign will actually force the Iranians to capitulate, all that it does is that it creates an escalatory cycle in which there will be a tit-for-tat. And if there are no exit ramps from this, then the tit-for-tat eventually will lead to a military confrontation. That's the danger here. The Iranian response, I think, more than anything else is symbolic in that sense. But what I think has happened internally, however, is more important. They are now closing ranks. They're seeing themselves as being in the same boat. And the divisions that existed within the regime between various parties is now essentially brushed over because they have this greater external threat. And the biggest losers out of that are those in Iran who have argued for trying to find some way to reconcile with the United States, to try to find some way to improve relations with the West and the United States. Those people who were championing the nuclear deal as a way of reducing tensions with the rest of the world. They are the biggest losers of this because they cannot show any longer that their diplomacy and their efforts for reconciliation have actually brought about a better situation for ordinary Iranians. On the contrary, it's only begotten them greater hostility because of what the Trump administration has decided to do.
Will this broaden U.S. military actions in Syria? Because now that they're calling the Iranian Revolutionary Guard terrorists, it will broaden their targets there?
I think there is a risk for that because we've seen how those people in the Trump administration, such as Bolton, who have constantly tried to make sure that the U.S.'s presence in Syria would continue, have had a hard time being able to justify that, both internally as well as externally. Trump has gone out and said that ISIS is defeated, time to go home. Bolton has done everything he could to be able to keep the troops there. And using Iran as a pretext for that by saying that the troops have to stay there in order to keep the Iranians out. Now he has a new argument. If the United States was there to defeat ISIS because it's a terrorist organization, even if Trump believes that that job is finished, he still hasn't finished the job as a whole, though, because the IRGC is in Syria and the IRGC is now designated a terrorist organization. So I suspect that argument will be used by those inside the administration in order to convince Trump that he needs to stay in Syria and probably to escalate tensions in Syria by starting to target the IRGC there. If that happens, then we are one giant step closer to a broader war.
Trita Parsi, we want to thank you for being with us, founder of the National Iranian American Council, most recent book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, also author of A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. Trita Parsi is an adjunct associate professor in the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Trump administration's policies around immigration. President Trump is calling on border guards to break the law to stop all people from coming into the United States and to get rid of immigration judges. We'll talk about all that and more coming up.
If I could go back to a time before now, before I ever fell down, go back to a time when I was just a girl, when I had the whole world gently wrapped around me, and no good thing could be taken away if I still believed it. Hearts don't lie, you're gonna be just fine. But hey, a lot's gonna change in your lifetime. Try to leave it all behind.
A lot's going to change by wise blood. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, President Trump is intensifying his crackdown on immigration as he purges the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. On Sunday, DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was forced out after reportedly resisting a move by Trump to revive his family separation policy at the U.S. southern border. Nielsen had overseen Trump's zero-tolerance family separation policy last year and came under fire by Democrats for lying to Congress about that policy, as well as for withholding information on children who died in U.S. custody. On Monday, the White House announced Secret Service Director Randolph Tex Alves had also been removed from his position. Several other high-ranking DHS officials are also reportedly on the verge of being purged. Meanwhile, on Friday, Trump withdrew nominee Ronald Vitiello to head Immigration and Customs Enforcement, indicating he wasn't, quote, tough enough for the role.
This all comes in the wake of Trump reportedly putting advisor Stephen Miller, longtime hardliner in immigration, in charge of the administration's immigration policy. The Wall Street Journal reports Miller's backed the reinstatement of Trump's family separation policy and has been pushing officials at the Homeland Security and Justice Departments to get in line with a more hardline immigration approach. Trump's named Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McAleenan acting DHS Secretary. McAleenan reportedly was open to reinstating a form of family separation, which families would have to choose between being separated or being taken into long-term detention with their children. Meanwhile, CNN's reporting Trump told border agents not to allow migrants entry at the border and to tell judges we don't have room. On Saturday, Trump repeated the claim during an address to the Republican Jewish coalition.
I'll do whatever is necessary to stop an invasion of our country. That's what it is. At the heart of the crisis are the Ninth Circuit rulings in the Flores case and the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, driving a staggering surge of illegal families and minors into the hands of our incredible Border Patrol people. They've done an incredible job. What they do is incredible. I was with them yesterday. So Congress must end catch and release so that illegal border crossers can be quickly and safely returned to their home. Get out. Sorry, get out. Sorry, can't handle it. And I told my people yesterday, our country's full. We're full. Our system's full. Our country is full. Can't come in. Our country is full. What can you do? We can't handle it anymore. Our country is full. Can't come in. I'm sorry. It's very simple.
Well, for more, we're joined by Erica Andiola, Chief Advocacy Officer for RACIS, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services. She's joining us from Phoenix, Arizona, a border state. Erica, if you can respond to this purging at Homeland Security and what's happening on the border.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me this morning. And it is really, really disturbing what is going on. We're very worried. We basically had the Secretary of Homeland Security, who was a person literally deciding to take our families apart, take the children away from their parents so that they can make a political, just basically send a political message out to the American people. This is the same person who was just fired because she wasn't tough enough. This is definitely, it's worrying us a lot because what we have seen already is that we already have children who are still actually being separated from their parents right now. We have a lot more people who are being detained with their kids in family detention centers. And it seems like what Trump is referring to right now in the speech that he just did is that he wants to double down on that. More families being detained and more people being, taken away from their children by using, these sort of scare tactics for the American public to think that, migrants are bad people, that they shouldn't be here when that's just not the reality.
And Erica, in terms of seeing Kirstjen Nielsen now, as you're saying, portrayed as a moderate, when she was really the leader of the family separation policy, and that the idea that she was not tough enough, what kind of signal does that send to immigrant rights groups across the country of what to expect in the next few months?
It's definitely not going to get any easier. We are under an administration that's being led by someone who's campaigning already for 2020. And what we have already seen, it's not just rhetoric. I mean, it's not just Trump, basically referring to migrants, with, I mean, you guys have already heard, what he has been saying about the undocumented community and the migrant community. So it's not just his rhetoric, it's also his policies. And, right now we have seen one of his policies, the return to Mexico or the remain in Mexico policy, he implemented the family separation policy. I mean, all these actions that he has taken has actually hurt a lot of people. We at Raíces have been working with clients who are going through this. We just literally not too long ago, had a baby, a 1-year-old baby in family detention, being sick for over 20 days. He wasn't being taken care of at all. And I mean, this is sort of stories that continue to occur. And unfortunately, he's not, really telling the truth that these folks are human beings who are seeking asylum in this country. And it's really not going to get any easier for us. So, we got to continue to fight back. We got to continue to, provide services and really helping these folks as they're detained, as they're coming in and asking for help, and really continue to use all the tools that we have, including, fighting back these policies through court, which is what we've been doing for a while now as well.
On Sunday, DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was forced out after reportedly resisting a move by Trump to revive his family separation policy at the U.S. border. But Nielsen oversaw Trump's zero-tolerance family separation policy, as you're saying, last year, coming under fire for Democrats for lying to Congress, as well as for withholding information on children who died in U.S. custody. At least 2 children died under Nielsen's leadership, 8-year-old Felipe Alonso Gomez and 7-year-old Jacqueline McKean, both in New Mexico. This is Nielsen speaking last year about the conditions of detained migrant children.
It is important to note that these minors are very well taken care of. Don't believe the press. They are very well taken care of. We operate according to some of the highest standards in the country. We provide food, medical, education, and all needs that the child requests.
This is Democratic Congressmember Bonnie Watson-Coleman of New Jersey questioning Nielsen about the conditions children are held in during a hearing last month.
What is a chain link fence enclosed into a chamber on a concrete floor represent to you? Is that a cage?
It's a detention space, ma'am, that has existed for decades.
Does it differ from the cages you put your dogs in when you let them stay outside? Is it different?
Yes.
In what sense?
It's larger. It has facilities. It provides room to sit, to stand, to lay down.
So did my dog's cage.
So did my dog's cage, said the Congress member in response to Kirstjen Nielsen. And this is the woman that President Trump says is not tough enough on policy. We're joined by, as well as Erica Andiola, Democracy Now! Correspondent and producer Renee Feltz, long reported on the criminalization of immigrants, family detention, and the business of detention. Renee.
Amy, you and I took the Democracy Now! Team to the border during this family separation crisis. And that was not long after Kirstjen Nielsen denied that family separation was happening. Remember, she at first said that zero tolerance doesn't mean that we're taking parents away from their children. Interestingly, that was later proven to be a lie when there was a release of a DHS memo that she had signed off on. Who else signed off on that? The new person who's taking her place, Customs and Border Protection head Kevin McElhaney. He was signed on that memo as well. And
by the way, in order for Trump to put him there,
yes,
he has to get rid of Claire Grady, who's in between, who would be the number 2. And it's not, well, we'll see if she's fired, because that is the order of succession.
He wants to get as quickly as he can to a yes person who will help him carry out Stephen Miller's policies. Stephen Miller is lurking in the background as an advisor. I think it's important to note that Kirstjen Nielsen opened the gates for family separation to happen. She was a yes person for Trump herself, even though she's being portrayed as someone who occasionally said no to Trump. Also, family separation continues to happen right now. The administration is acknowledging, and they say that sometimes they're separating children who come with their parents for their own safety. Amy, there was a recording of a young girl who was separated from her mother that was shared with ProPublica. It was wrenching to listen to. You can hear the child sobbing. And anyone who's heard that will never forget what Kirstjen Nielsen's legacy is about.
I think we have that ProPublica audio from inside a U.S. Customs and Border Protection facility where children were between the ages of 4 and 10 and are heard crying "Mama" and "Papi" after being separated from their parents. This is the audio.
Well, we have an orchestra here, right? What we're missing is a conductor.
That's a border agent saying that.
And Renee, yeah, that was a border agent, yes.
Incredible to see that people carried out this policy, to hear it carried out. Kirstjen Nielsen was one of those people. She helped President Trump. You know, it's interesting. We've seen the New York Times yesterday. They had an editorial they ran called "Who is Left to Say No to Trump?" And it implies that Kirstjen Nielsen said no. And I disagree with that characterization. I think she helped pave the way for a lot of these policies that are continuing. We see her replacement now wants to carry out what he calls binary choice, sort of like a Sophie's Choice. These parents who travel all the way north with their children to bring them to safety in America are told, you have a choice. You can agree to let us take your child while we detain you while you seek asylum, or you can detain the child with you. And we've heard about the horrible conditions in these facilities. So that's kind of what she opened the gates for. And
what about the people who say no?
Well, there's a lot of people saying no, and I'm glad you brought that up, Amy, because I think there's people saying no in the courts, and there's people saying no at the local level. In the courts, we just saw 2 huge victories. Kirstjen Nielsen, one of her proud achievements as the DHS secretary was to work with Trump's son-in-law and close advisor Jared Kushner on getting Mexico to agree to hold people while they were seeking asylum instead of letting them stay in the U.S. We saw a judge overturn that yesterday, or put a hold on that. A major victory. On Friday, we saw another major victory where people who are seeking asylum and have a credible fear granted to them can now have a bond hearing and seek their release before a judge within 7 days instead of being indefinitely detained. So we're seeing pushback on that level. In California, they passed a state law where they limited the expansion of immigrant detention centers. And many of these facilities, and I wanted to bring this up real quick because many of these facilities are now having their contracts ended with the cities. For example, Adelanto, California, ended their contract with the second largest facility holding immigrants in California, run by Geo Group. That contract could now come back as a contract just between ICE and Geo Group. And so while people are saying there's success in California pushing back, we could actually see an end run with an increase in family detention there. One other quick thing, we're seeing cities reject permits for these facilities that hold children in detention. We saw it in Houston, and just this week, I believe yesterday, we saw it in Philadelphia.
Well, we're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Renee, you mentioned Sophie's Choice, and so we're going to bring in the uncle of the man who is now the point person on immigration, even further consolidated, Stephen Miller. Renee Feltz and Erica Andiola, please stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, back in 30 seconds. Beneath the Concrete by Lost Under Heaven. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue to look at President Trump's intensifying crackdown on immigration amidst a purge of the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to go back to Trump for just a second. Saturday, addressing the Republican-Jewish coalition.
And the asylum program is a scam. Some of the roughest people you've ever seen. people that look like they should be fighting for the UFC. They read a little page given by lawyers that are all over the place. You know, lawyers. They tell them what to say. You look at this guy, you say, wow, that's a tough cookie. I am very fearful for my life. I am very worried that I will be accosted. If I am sent back home, no, he'll do the accosting. Asylum. Oh, give him asylum. He's afraid. He's afraid. We don't love the fact that he's got tattoos on his face. That's not a good sign. We don't love the fact that he's carrying the flag of Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador, only to say he's petrified to be in his country.
That's President Trump speaking Saturday to the Republican Jewish coalition in Las Vegas. This all comes as Trump has reportedly put advisor Stephen Miller, longtime hardliner on immigration, in charge of the administration's immigration policy. The Wall Street Journal reports Miller's backed the reinstatement of Trump's family separation policy, has been pushing officials at Homeland Security and Justice to get in line with a more hardline immigration approach. As we turn now to Philadelphia, where we're joined by Dr. David Glosser, the uncle of Stephen Miller, retired neuropsychologist and former faculty member at Boston University School of Medicine and Jefferson Medical College. Dr. Glosser works as a volunteer with refugees in Philadelphia. Last year, he wrote a piece for Politico headlined, "Stephen Miller is an immigration hypocrite. I know because I'm his uncle." Dr. Glosser, if you can respond to this speech that President Trump gave to the Republican Jewish coalition, as he talked about the country being full, it makes you think of the MS St. Louis in World War II, that the U.S. would now not allow to dock with over 900 Jews who were eventually sent back, many of them to die. This is your nephew, Stephen Miller, who President Trump is working with even more closely, if possible. Your thoughts?
I have a couple of points to make on this, Amy. Thanks for inviting me to speak on this subject. First point I'd like to make, I think, is a general point about racial hatreds and ethnic hatreds. It's kind of axiomatic that the worse we've treated, worse that one group treats another group, the greater their need to demonize that group in order to justify the repression or exploitation of them. So here we see Trump spewing vitriol and lies regarding the asylum seekers and trying to characterize them all as gangsters or criminals, or even using the word, having implied that they're vermin during his explosive rants before the midterms. It doesn't really represent the reality at all, and it's the same racial and ethnic hatred that's faced other ethnic groups trying to come into the country at other times in our history. There's really nothing new about it. In fact, even the moniker, so-called America Firsters, it's the same stuff that was heard back when my ancestors tried to come into this country, and some succeeded in doing so. The other point, I guess, that I'd like to make, I don't know that it's been made explicitly, is I would refer people to do a computer search under the phrase International Committee of the Red Cross, hostage-taking, war crimes, and U.S. military code. And in there you will find a description of the U.S. military code regarding the taking of hostages and the definition of it, which holds that taking hostages among civilians for the purpose of causing them or someone else to either take a course of action or to stop taking a course of action during a conflict, during a war, is actually a capital crime and punishable by life imprisonment or death. So I fail to see the real distinction between separating children from their parents and holding them prisoner with no apparent clear intention of ever reuniting them again or even keeping track of them, for the purpose of deterring legal attempts to make asylum claims in the United States and hostage taking in time of war. So it's not something that's allowed even to armies during times of desperate conflict between nations. But here, we've become so deconditioned and so anesthetized to outrage that we accept it as a matter of course now. Next point I'd like to make, I guess. Go ahead.
Dr. Glasser, I wanted to ask you about this whole the statement that President Trump made about the country is full. He's made many fabrications, but this is one of the most easily disprovable fabrication that he's claiming that the United States is now full with people. I did a quick search just of population densities of countries around the world. There's, according to the United Nations, of 277 nations and territories in the world, the United States is 177th. We're at the bottom half of population density in the world. I mean, places like Bangladesh have more than 3,000 people per square mile, India 1,100, China 390, even France 308, Great Britain 712 people per square mile, Germany 611. The United States has 92 people per square mile of its territory. It's in the bottom half of population density in the world. For him to say that our nation is full, then that means that most of the nations in the world are full right now. It's amazing. It seems more, it's not the question of the country being full, it's who's coming in. I think that's the issue that you're saying in terms of the demonization of the folks that are coming in.
Yeah, there's a couple of points here. First, in general, Juan, you're barking up the logic tree, and you're not going to find President Trump at the top of the logic tree. So trying to make logical refutations of his explanations of a crisis, it's a fruitless exercise and a distraction. Of course, he lies just to stay in practice, it seems. But the real border crisis that we face here, and the real crisis for Trump, is not the fact that there's been a spike in the flood of families fleeing from the failed states in Central America is not a problem for Trump. That's his opportunity. That's essentially the only thing he has to offer to his red meat base. He was elected in large part because he was willing to stir up and divide, and to stir up ethnic hatreds and fears and anxieties about so-called invaders. He doubled down on that during the midterms, famously putting himself on the ballot and his policies on the ballot, and having really an explosive rants of ethnic and racial fear at the midterms. And he was stunningly repudiated. He seems to have just decided he's going to double down on that bet again. And so here we see the set of policies that he's followed since the inauguration, since the campaign, of trying to exclude people who come from the wrong countries, as you point out, by making the so-called Muslim ban, which was overturned in the courts. Now yesterday's decision by the courts invalidating the decision to hold people in Mexico before making an asylum claim. He's got an unpopular tax bill. He's not going to be the health care president.
Dr. Glasser, we only have 30 seconds, and I'm wondering if you have a message for your nephew, for Stephen Miller.
Well, listen, that's going to be I don't really have a message for him that I haven't otherwise explained. His history is going to be one of great interest, I think, to psychobiographers in the future as to how this all came to pass and why he feels this way and so forth. But frankly, who cares about that? It's the public persona. It's the public acts of the administration. It's the craven cowardice of the Republican Party. Those are the things we're interested in. The only thing that's going to solve this problem is not logical argument. What's going to solve this problem is the United States must start a three-pronged approach towards solving it, which is to reduce the pressures for out-migration from these failed states through a sort of immigration Marshall Plan, trying to revise our laws to help with temporary migrants, and then to set realistic and fair admission standards for true asylum seekers.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we're going to do part 2 with Dr. David Glasser, uncle of Stephen Miller, Erica Andiola of Racis, and Renee Feltz of Democracy Now! Thanks.